Welcome to the deep dive. We're about to jump into something pretty fascinating today.
Yeah, it takes a bit of news, a bit of politics, and really spins it out into some, well, much bigger ideas.
Exactly. Our source is an article by Larkin Rose. It's titled Elon Musk and the Big Beautiful Bill.
Right. But, it's not just about Musk or Trump, even though they're in the title.
No, not at all. Rose uses Musk's criticism of this huge federal spending bill.
The same one Trump actually sported, which is interesting in itself.
Right. He uses that whole situation as a launch pad. It's really a deep look at philosophy, psychology, and propaganda.
It's like a framework almost.
Mm.
A different way to look at people, power, how these systems actually function.
Okay, so that's our mission then. We're going to unpack Rose's main arguments here. We really want to get a handle on these distinctions he makes and, philosophy, psychology, propaganda.
And then see what his advice is strategically for people trying to make sense of it all, especially when you have these really powerful figures acting in, well, let's say confusing ways within the system.
Yeah, confusing is a good word for it sometimes. We'll touch on ideas like controlled opposition.
And grapple with the fact that people aren't just, good guys and bad guys. It's usually more complicated.
And we'll get into Rose's take, which might ruffle some feathers about why maybe, just maybe, pushing away anyone who seems to be questioning things could be a big strategic mistake.
Okay, so where does Rose start? You mentioned his framework.
Yeah, he kicks off by saying, look, a lot of people who advocate for freedom hit this wall because they don't really have a clear way to sort through what's going on.
They're missing some pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. So he breaks it down into these three categories.
Philosophy, psychology, and propaganda. Let's take philosophy first. For Rose, this is the realm of, core principles. Voluntarism, non-aggression, self-ownership.
Yeah.
The basics.
The ideal scenario. How things should work in a truly free, ethical world based on logic and rights.
Right. That's the should be.
Okay, so if that's the ideal, where does propaganda come in?
Propaganda is kind of the system's weapon against philosophy, you could say. It's all the narratives, the spin.
The stories, the state, the media, whoever pushes to keep control.
Exactly. It shapes how people see things, makes them okay with authority, manufactures that consent.
Got it. Ideal philosophy, control tool, propaganda. What about the third one, psychology?
Psychology is where it gets messy. It's how actual people, real human beings, behave when they're caught between those ideals which they might not even fully grasp or agree with, and all this propaganda washing over them.
So it's the reality on the ground, human motivations, beliefs, actions, all that complex stuff.
Yeah. And Rose's critique, his main point here, is that a lot of freedom advocates focus heavily on the philosophy.
They know the principles.
Right. And maybe they see the propaganda pretty clearly, but they kind of skip over the psychology part.
And what's the result of that, according to him?
It leads to this really simplistic way of seeing people. Like you're either pure evil, an enemy, or you're a pure ally on the team.
Black and white, no gray areas.
Exactly. And he argues that stops you from understanding the actual complexities. Why do people participate in a system built on coercion? Why do they support it? It's often not simple malice.
Which is why he says we need that nuance, especially when looking at someone like, say, Elon Musk, who says and does things that seem all over the map politically.
And that complexity, that need for nuance, ties right into this next big idea he explores. Controlled opposition.
Ah, yes. This is where things get potentially controversial, maybe. The idea that people who look like they're fighting each other
Might actually, whether they mean to or not, be playing roles that keep the overall power structure in place.
He uses that example we mentioned. Trump signs off on this massive spending bill.
Something his base probably hated.
Right. And then Musk comes out swinging, calls it an abomination. Seems like a clear conflict.
But Rose steps back. He doesn't jump to conclusions about who's sincere and who isn't.
That's key, isn't it? The ambiguity.
Totally.
Yeah.
He says, look, maybe Musk is genuinely appalled. Maybe he's starting to see the waste and the coercion for what it is. That's possible.
Oh.
Or his public criticism, even if it feels real, could just be part of the show. A way to let off steam, channel discontent without ever actually threatening the foundations of state power. It could be conscious, it could be unconscious, but it serves a purpose within the system.
So the controlled part isn't necessarily about secret meetings, but more about how the system itself can absorb and redirect opposition.
That's definitely part of how Rose presents it. It makes it really hard to know someone's true motivations just from their public actions, especially these high-profile figures.
Which connects back to his point about avoiding simple labels. not just villains or heroes.
Right. He talks about people existing on a spectrum, particularly in relation to the state.
Okay, what does that spectrum look like in his view?
Well, at one extreme, he puts psychopaths or sociopaths, people genuinely driven by a desire for power, who lack empathy, who are knowingly destructive. He suggests trying to reason with them based on principles is probably, a waste of time.
Okay, the truly malicious actors.
Right.
But they're not the majority, presumably.
No, he thinks the vast majority fall into categories like statists or bureaucrats. These are people who might honestly, genuinely believe they're doing good.
They think government is the solution, or at least a necessary tool.
Yeah, they're trying to fix problems, improve society, whatever, but they're doing it within the state framework. From a voluntarist view, their actions are coercive, but their intentions might not be malicious. They might just be misguided.
And what's at the other end of the spectrum?
He talks about former believers. He uses the example, and it's a good one, that many active voluntarists today, maybe even himself, used to be part of the system.
Like former military or former Republicans or Democrats?
Exactly. People who once believed in the state, maybe worked for it, but then had a fundamental shift in their thinking. Their existence proves that people can change, that moving away from statism is possible.
And this distinction about intention, Rose really hammers this home, doesn't he?
He does. He's very clear. Someone's good intentions never make a coercive act okay. Robbing someone to give to the poor, the intention might be noble to some, but the act is still robbery.
Right. The action itself is what matters ethically.
But, and this is the crucial psychological point, understanding their intention tells you whether you can even have a productive conversation.
Because if someone truly believes they're doing the right thing, even if you think they're wrong,
There's an opening. You can challenge their premises, offer alternatives, engage with their reasoning. But if someone is just acting out of pure lust for control, what's the basis for a principled discussion? It's likely pointless.
okay, that makes sense. So how does he apply this whole framework, philosophy, psychology, propaganda, the spectrum, intention to Trump and Musk specifically? Let's start with Trump.
He sees Trump as almost a textbook example, I think he says, of controlled opposition, or at least fitting that historical pattern.
Why? What's the argument there?
Rose argues Trump masterfully tapped into real anti-establishment anger. People were fed up with Washington, with the status quo. He promised to shake things up, drain the swamp, reduce government power.
Things many people desperately wanted to hear.
Absolutely. But then Rose points to the track record. Government spending went up, surveillance powers were expanded or continued, foreign policy remained militaristic.
So the rhetoric was anti-state, but the actions were more state.
That's Rose's analysis. He sees it as a classic move, gain power by promising freedom, then use that power to actually strengthen the state apparatus. It's a pattern he sees repeating throughout history.
Okay, that's his interpretation of Trump through this lens. What about Elon Musk? He's the other figure in the title.
Right. Rose paints Musk as a kind of statist technophile. He acknowledges the guy is brilliant, a visionary.
Maybe not the hands-on engineer for everything, but the driving force.
Yeah, something like that. Possibly neurodivergent, sees the world differently. But the key part of Rose's analysis is Musk's deep integration with the state.
You mean the government contracts?
Exactly. SpaceX relying heavily on NASA and military launches, Tesla benefiting hugely from government subsidies and mandates, Solar City too. He operates within and often thanks to the existing statist system.
And Rose also mentions the tech itself, like the brain-computer interfaces, Neuralink.
Yeah, he points out that while Musk might frame these things as purely beneficial progress for humanity,
Saving us, helping people.
right, but from a voluntarist perspective, that kind of tech raises huge red flags. Potential for control, for abuse by future states or powerful groups. It fits a more, let's say, dystopian potential narrative for some.
Okay, so deeply embedded in the state, pushing potentially risky tech. But applying that nuance again, Rose doesn't just write him off as, like, a Bond villain.
No, definitely not. And this is central to his whole point. He suggests that despite all these statist connections and potentially worrying tech directions, Musk might genuinely believe he's doing good.
Like the statist bureaucrat category, but maybe on a grander tech-focused scale.
Sort of. He might truly see space exploration, electric cars, even neural links as vital for humanity's future, and sees partnering with the state as just a practical necessity to get it done. Rose finds that belief system dangerous because it props up the state. But it's also potentially redeemable. If someone like Musk starts to really question the reliance on coercion, the state partnerships, then maybe they can be reached. Maybe they can start questioning the whole foundation of authority.
Which brings us right to what might be the most challenging part of Rose's argument for some freedom advocates.
Strategic part. Why he thinks it's a mistake to immediately write off and alienate people like Musk, or he mentions Joe Rogan too, just because they aren't perfect voluntarists right now.
Because the impulse is strong, right? You see someone working with the government, getting subsidies, holding some views you disagree with.
And the reaction is often to apply that purity test, as Rose calls it, to say, nope, you're compromised, you're part of the problem, and just dismiss them.
And Rose says, hold on, that might be shooting ourselves in the foot.
Strategically, yes.
Yeah.
He argues these figures, even with their flaws and inconsistencies, are actually a massive opportunity.
Why? Because of their reach.
Exactly. They have enormous platforms. They reach millions, hundreds of millions of people who probably never hear about voluntarism or non-aggression from dedicated anarchist channels.
So getting them to even mention these ideas is valuable.
Hugely valuable in Rose's view, even if they just discuss it, debate it, ask questions about self-ownership or the legitimacy of the state. That introduces the concepts to a vast new audience. The discussion itself is a win.
And there's also the chance they might evolve themselves.
That's the other angle. If these influential people start getting disillusioned with the system, maybe they see the corruption, the waste, the control up close. That's a critical moment.
A moment they might actually be open to hearing a different way, a coherent alternative like voluntarism.
Precisely. And if the freedom movement has already burned that bridge by attacking them relentlessly,
The opportunity was lost.
right. So Rose argues for engaging, for being ready to present the ideas when someone influential shows even a flicker of interest or doubt. It's about leveraging those platforms in those moments of potential change.
It's about potentially sparking mainstream conversations on really fundamental questions like, do we even need a ruling class? Things that usually only get discussed in niche circles.
Yeah, and that seems to be Rose's ultimate strategic aim here. It's not about demanding everyone become a perfect anarchist overnight.
It's about broadening the conversation itself, making the questions more mainstream.
He has that really powerful quote you mentioned earlier. When people are discussing the question of, do we need a ruling class?
Yeah.
We already won.
That does reframe things, doesn't it? It's not about winning every argument immediately, but about shifting the bounds of acceptable debate.
Getting the core ideas onto the table for public consideration, he uses the Joe Rogan example. Getting someone with that kind of audience to just talk about voluntarism, even if he pushes back or doesn't fully agree, is potentially revolutionary in terms of sheer exposure.
It makes the ideas less fringe, more thinkable.
Exactly. It normalizes the discussion.
Okay, this article definitely gives you a lot to chew on. Let's try and distill the main takeaways from Rose's perspective here.
Okay. First, and maybe most importantly, try to understand the whole picture, philosophy, propaganda, and psychology, before you label people or situations. Understand how the system really works and how people function within it.
Right. And part of that is recognizing that people's motivations, especially those within state systems, are often complex. They might genuinely think they're doing good, even if their actions are coercive from your perspective. Don't assume malice immediately.
Yeah, and resist that urge for purity tests. Don't automatically push away or attack people just because they aren't perfect voluntarists yet, especially if they're starting to question things or have a huge platform.
Instead, maybe see those moments of questioning or public criticism of the state as openings, opportunities to introduce voluntarist principles as a consistent, logical alternative.
And finally, think strategically about influence and reach. Be willing to engage with flawed but curious figures. Getting the core ideas discussed widely is a huge strategic win, even if the messenger isn't perfect.
It's definitely a challenge Rose lays down to look beyond the easy labels, understand the complex psychology, and think more strategically about how ideas spread and how change happens.
Yeah, it's really a call to refine how you analyze things. Focus on nuance, understand the human element within these big systems, and maybe prioritize outreach and expanding the conversation over condemnation and ideological gatekeeping.
So let's leave you, the listener, with something to think about, drawing from Rose's ideas. If intent doesn't justify coercion, like Rose says, but it does affect whether dialogue is even possible, how do you personally draw the line? Who do you decide is worth engaging with when talking about freedom and power?
And how do you navigate that tricky distinction he makes between the system itself and the complex, sometimes contradictory human beings operating within it for all sorts of reasons?